The day began not with the sun, but with a number. 38 degrees Fahrenheit on the old mercury barometer. Cold enough to keep the snow crisp, but not so bitter as to freeze a man's thoughts. Ben Carter's knuckles cracked as he fed birch logs into the belly of the cast-iron stove. The sound was a familiar punctuation mark in the deep silence of his cabin, a daily declaration of war against entropy. The stove was black iron, scarred from decades of service, its heat a living presence in the center of the room. It radiated outward, pushing back the cold that seeped through the chinked logs of the walls. A cold that was not a temperature but a form of patient pressure from the wilderness outside. He moved through the pre-dawn gloom with an economy of motion honed by 30 years of solitude. The coffee grounds, coarse and dark, went into the percolator. The aroma that soon filled the single room was thick and resinous, another layer of defense against the vast empty wilderness. While the coffee burbled, he sat at his scarred pine table, his hands moving over the brass casings of his rifle cartridges. The hands were a cartographer's map of a hard life, roped with veins, crisscrossed with white scars, but they were steady. He wiped each round with an oiled cloth, inspecting for the faintest bloom of corrosion. A tool was only as good as its maintenance. A life was only as good as its tools. He weighed them in his palm, feeling their dense promise. He spun each one, watching the light catch the polished brass, a small ritual of respect for the thing that brought meat to his table and peace to his mind. Outside, the world was a study in grayscale. Ben stepped onto his trapline, a network of trails he'd blazed and maintained until they were as much a part of him as his own circulatory system. This was not a walk. It was a reading. The snow was a page written overnight, and he was its most dedicated scholar. A fox's delicate stitchwork here, the splayed, purposeful tracks of a wolverine there, a broad highway churned by a migrating herd of caribou. He knew this language better than the one he'd spoken in cities, a tongue now foreign and distant. He knelt, his knees protesting, to adjust a rabbit snare, the wire humming faintly in the cold. He tested its tension, the lethal loop just wide enough for a head, just low enough to be unseen. A few yards on, he uncorked a small vial and dripped 2 drops of beaver castor onto a lure for marten. The scent was a pungent promise, his own private perfume of death and survival. The smell was sharp, animal, an offense to a civilized nose, but to Ben it was the smell of work, of sustenance. His skinning shed was a place of surgical precision. A lynx, caught 2 days prior, hung from a gambrel. Ben's knife, a well-used buck, moved with the unhurried grace of a master craftsman. He made the initial cuts around the paws, the blade parting the fur with a soft, tearing sound. He worked the hide back from the muscle, his fingers finding the thin membrane between tissue and pelt. There was no cruelty in it, only a profound and unsentimental respect. The animal had lost its life, and in return, he would waste nothing. The pelt was for trade, the meat for his pot, the guts for bait. Even the skull would be boiled clean and set on a shelf, another entry in his physical ledger of the land. It was the unwritten law of the taiga, a cycle he honored not with prayers, but with efficiency. His cabin was his fortress. The walls were adorned not with art, but with information. Topographical maps, annotated with his own cryptic symbols marking game trails, mineral deposits, and deadfalls. Below them, his arsenal, the Winchester M70, his workhorse. A Mossberg M500 by the door for close arguments. And on the highest rack, the Ruger M77 he called the Peacemaker, a rifle of immense power reserved for the one predator that could challenge him for dominion, the grizzly. Shelves groaned with the fruits of his labor, jars of canned meat, pickled fiddleheads, dried mushrooms, and herbs. The order was absolute. Every item had its place, a system designed to be navigated in total darkness. The only voice from the outside world came from a shortwave radio. He did not listen for news of politics or markets. That world had burned down for him long ago. He listened for weather reports and the crackling chatter of bush pilots, their disembodied voices a reminder of a species he no longer belonged to. Tonight the static was heavy, the voices faint, swallowed by the immense distance. As night fell, he lit a kerosene lamp, its yellow light pushing the shadows into the corners. From a locked footlocker he retrieved a small, worn box. Inside lay a single photograph of a woman and a young girl, their smiles from another lifetime. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. He did not read them. He looked, his face a granite mask, his eyes reflecting the quiet, crushing weight of his vigil. He traced the edge of the photograph with a calloused thumb, a gesture devoid of softness, a simple acknowledgement of a debt. The past was a ghost that lived in the box. He did not let it out. He paid his respects at its tomb. It was his penance. Before sleep, he placed his charged revolver on the nightstand. His codex was simple. Rule 1. Kill only for need. Rule 2. Respect your quarry, be it beast or storm. Rule 3. Leave no trace of your cowardice. Rule 4. Your territory is your responsibility. Defend it. A storm was coming, one that would test every article of his faith. Routine was the bedrock of Ben's sanity. The second a crack appeared in that foundation, the entire structure felt unstable. The crack appeared at dawn, 2 days later, at the beaver dam a mile north of his cabin. The air was colder now, a damp chill that clung to the creek bottom and turned his breath to thick steam. He'd set a Kana beer 330 there, a powerful body-gripping trap designed to kill instantly. It was anchored with a length of aircraft-grade steel cable, rated for a 2,000-pound breaking strain, bolted to a submerged log. He had sunk the log himself, driving rebar through it into the creek bed, a piece of engineering meant to hold against the full panic of a 200-pound black bear, let alone a beaver. When he arrived, the trap was not just sprung. It was gone. The anchor log had been torn from the muddy, half-frozen bank, gouging a deep wound in the earth. Chunks of ice and dark soil were thrown 5 feet from the hole. The steel cable, not broken but stretched taut as a piano wire, led him into the willows. Ben followed the drag marks for 20 yards to where the trap lay in the open. It was not a beaver he found. It was an artifact of impossible physics. He picked it up, the cold steel biting at his bare hands. The Kana beer 330 was a brutal piece of engineering. To set its dual springs, Ben had to use a special leverage tool, planting his feet and putting the full weight of his body into the effort. The recoil, if it slipped, could break a man's arm. Now, those thick steel spring arms were not broken, but bent. They were twisted into smooth, grotesque curves like soft wire. He ran a thumb over the deformation. A grizzly's rage was a percussive fury. It would have shattered the mechanism or smashed it against a rock. This was different. He knew the tensile strength of that steel. He knew what it took to deform it. This was a slow, inexorable application of force. The trap had been squeezed in a hydraulic press. It was a quiet, deliberate violence more alien than any animal rage. Ben's mind, trained in geology and the immutable laws of force and material tolerance, rebelled. He scanned the area, his hunter's eye becoming an investigator's. No blood. Not a single tuft of fur caught in the mangled steel. The ground was churned, but the impressions were wrong. They were deep and smeared, not the distinct clawed print of a bear. Something heavy had simply stood there and methodically, deliberately destroyed the trap. It had not been caught and fought its way free. It had found the trap and executed it. The sheer wrongness of it settled in his gut like a cold stone. Back in the cabin, the coffee tasted bitter. He forced himself to think logically, to suppress the cold knot forming in his stomach. The thought of a young, unusually strong grizzly felt thin, a flimsy patch over a gaping hole in his understanding of the world. Bears did not play with steel. They feared the scent of it or broke it in anger. This quiet, purposeful destruction was what terrified him. He opened his journal, a thick, leather-bound ledger, and sketched the damaged trap, noting the direction of the torsion and the lack of collateral evidence. He drew arrows indicating the vectors of force, a geologist diagramming a fault line. The act of documenting was an attempt to impose order on chaos, a prayer to the god of reason. That night, the silence of the forest was different. It was not the peaceful quiet of a world at rest. It was a held breath. The owls were silent. The usual yip of a distant fox never came. The entire ecosystem was listening, waiting. Ben sat in his chair, the Winchester across his knees, analyzing the absence of sound. Absence was a presence. It was a pressure on the ears, a sign that a greater predator was near, one that silenced all others. The next morning, he changed his strategy. The trapline could wait. Survival came first. He did not set new traps. Instead, he worked the perimeter of his half-acre clearing, stringing thin monofilament fishing line at ankle height between trees. To each line, he tied a cluster of spent brass shell casings. They would not stop anything, but they would sing a warning. He worked with a grim focus, his movements precise, his jaw set. As he cinched the last knot, he saw his hands were trembling. The cold was a familiar ache, but this tremor came from a deeper place. The first crack in a certainty he had held for 3 decades, that he was alone. 2 days passed, marked by an unnerving quiet. The forest remained muted, watchful. The tripwires remained silent, their brass cartridges hanging like frozen fruit. The stillness frayed his nerves more than any sound could have. On the 3rd morning, Ben found the caribou, or what was left of it. He'd been tracking a large bull for a day, noting its path toward the high meadows. He found the kill site not by sight, but by the iron-rich smell of blood on the wind, a metallic tang that cut through the clean scent of pine. The scene stopped him cold, his snowshoes sinking as he stood frozen in place. The bull, an animal that would have weighed over 400 pounds, had not been eaten on the ground. The carcass was wedged, almost 30 feet up, in the thick branches of an old spruce tree. A cougar lacked the raw power to haul a full-grown caribou bull to such a height, not without leaving a trail of dragged gut and torn earth. Ben circled the base of the spruce, his gaze analytical. The bark was not scored with the thin, parallel lines of cat claws. It was gouged with deep, vertical furrows, as if something had ascended by digging in with thick, powerful digits. The wood was splintered, the raw cambium layer exposed. High above, Caught on a splintered branch were several long, coarse hairs. They were a dark, slate gray, unlike any fur he knew. Not the brown of a bear, the tan of a cougar, or the gray of a wolf. He carefully tweezed them free with his multi-tool and secured them in an empty matchbox. He snapped the box shut. The sound was unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. He followed the disturbed snow away from the tree, toward a small, spring-fed creek, where the ground was softer, less frozen. And there it was. On a patch of thawing mud, printed with perfect, shocking clarity, was the evidence that shattered his rationalizations. It was a footprint, but it was like nothing he had ever seen. It was humanoid in its five-toed structure, but it was monstrous in scale, easily the size of a dinner plate. He saw the distinct impression of 5 broad, claw-tipped digits and an elongated heel. The morphology was a disturbing hybrid, somewhere between the paw of a wolf and the bare foot of a man. The sheer weight it implied was staggering. The print was sunk 4 inches into the mud. Ben knelt, his breath misting in the cold air. He measured the stride to the next partial print. The distance was immense, suggesting a bipedal creature easily 9 feet tall. This was no longer an anomaly. It was a discovery. The geologist in him took over from the hunter. From his pack, he retrieved his old Pentax K1000, a fully manual film camera he trusted more than any digital device. It was heavy, all metal and glass, a tool built to function in the Arctic or the desert. He placed his buck 110 knife next to the print for scale, and took a series of careful bracketed shots from multiple angles. He then documented it in his journal, sketching the print with painstaking detail, measuring its length, width, and depth. He noted the splay of the toes, the impression of the arch. This was not a hunt anymore. It was an investigation. That night, a sharp metallic clatter cut through the wind. One of his perimeter alarms on the far side of the clearing. The sound was a quick, jangling chime. Then silence. Ben did not move. He extinguished the kerosene lamp with a puff of breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. He picked up the peacemaker, its weight a familiar comfort, and attached his old passive vision system 4 night vision scope, a relic from a past life. The bulk of it changed the rifle's balance, making it feel like a weapon of war. He crept to the window, becoming just another shadow in a room full of them. Through the green-hued world of the scope, he saw nothing but snow and trees. But he felt it. A presence. He strained his ears and heard it. A low, resonant exhalation of breath just at the edge of hearing. A heavy thump as something shifted its weight. A single twig snapped with a sound far too substantial for a fox or a wolf. It was out there, watching his cabin, watching him. For the first time in 30 years, Ben Carter felt the cold, primal certainty that he was no longer the apex predator on his own land. He was being scouted, and whatever was out there was intelligent. He rejected the easy, foolish comfort of myths like Sasquatch or Wendigo. This was an unknown species, a terrestrial, biological entity, and it was hostile. The point of no return came not with a roar, but with the quiet devastation of a violated sanctuary. Half a mile from his cabin stood his winter cache, a small, stout log hut where he stored the bulk of his preserved meat, smoked fish, and dry goods. It was built into the hillside, half buried for insulation, as solid as a bunker. The door, made of 2-inch thick oak planks and barred with a railroad tie dropped into heavy iron brackets, had been torn from its heavy iron hinges and tossed aside like a piece of kindling. The railroad tie lay 20 feet away, half buried in a snowdrift. Ben stood before the wreckage, the peacemaker held at a low ready. The cold fury building in his chest was a familiar, dangerous friend. It was a dry, clean anger, the kind that sharpened the senses. The interior of the cache was chaos, but it was a chaos with a terrifying grammar. This was not the work of a hungry animal. A bear would have gorged itself, ripping open everything in a frenzy of gluttony, leaving a sticky, greasy mess. Here, sacks of flour and cornmeal were slashed open, their contents spilled and mixed with the dirt floor, but largely uneaten. Tins of beans were dented and crushed, their metal skins puckered as if squeezed in a giant fist, but not punctured. Strips of his finest smoked salmon, a winter's treasure, were scattered and trampled into the mud. A season's worth of hard labor lay in ruins, rendered inedible. It was not about hunger. It was a message, a demonstration of contemptuous power. This is my land now. Your efforts are meaningless. Your fortress is a toy. The act was too precise, too symbolic. It was a territorial marking on a scale he had never imagined. For Ben, this was more than a loss of supplies. It was a profound personal violation. The forest had its laws. A grizzly could raid a camp for food. That was the nature of things, a risk one accepted. But this was vandalism. This was a deliberate act of desecration. It was an invasion, a crossing of a line that had existed, unspoken, for 3 decades. The solitary pride of the homesteader and the primal instinct of the territorial male fused into a single, cold, crystalline purpose. The invader had not just stolen his food. It had stolen his peace. The debate in his mind was over. The rationalizations, a scientific curiosity, they evaporated like mist in the face of this blatant declaration of war. He stared at the ruined doorway, and the geologist, the hermit, the grieving husband, all receded. Only the hunter remained. He would not wait to be besieged. He would not cower in his cabin. He would take the fight to this thing. He would follow its trail, and he would extinguish it, not for revenge, but for order. An intolerable threat had manifested in his world, and the law of the taiga demanded it be removed. Amid the ruin, the invader had made a mistake. Its arrogance had made it sloppy. Ben spotted a fresh, deep splinter in the door jamb where the lock had been. He knelt, his nose inches from the wood. A sharp, musky, almost reptilian odor clung to the spot, a scent like ozone and wet soil. And then he saw it, a sliver of black, chitinous material wedged deep in the grain. He worked it free with the tip of his knife. It was a piece of a claw, thick and curving, but with a strange, almost blade-like edge. It was not keratin, like a bear's. It was harder, denser, with a slight sheen like obsidian. The creature had left its signature. Back in his cabin, Ben did not storm about in a rage. He sat at his table with a topographical map, the claw fragment resting beside the compass. He traced the creature's likely path, factoring in the terrain, wind direction, and the location of the kill sites. He was a strategist now, not a mere tracker. He was planning a campaign. Before he began to assemble his gear, he took a sheet of paper from his journal. With a pencil, he wrote, "Gone north, toward the Black Ridge. Following tracks. Coordinates attached." He folded the note, slid it into an empty mason jar, and screwed the lid on tight. He placed it in the center of the table, a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of wilderness. The odds of it ever being read were 0, but it was a ritual of the sane, a final nod to a world where men sometimes went into the wild and did not return. The hunt required more than just resolve. It required ritual. Ben laid a clean, oiled canvas on his table and began the methodical disassembly of the peacemaker. The M77 was a simple, brutally effective bolt-action rifle, and he knew every pin, spring, and screw by touch alone. Each component was placed in a specific spot on the canvas, an ordered array of blued steel and wood. He cleaned the barrel until the rifling gleamed, pushing patches through until they came out bone white. He scrubbed the bolt face with a brass brush, removing every trace of powder residue. He wiped down the trigger assembly until it was free of the slightest grit. He lubricated the action, not with standard gun oil, which would grow sluggish in the deep cold to come, but with a specialized graphite lubricant. This was not mere maintenance. It was a sacrament, a way of focusing his will, of becoming one with the tool that would be the final arbiter between his life and its. He did not trust factory ammunition for this task. From a locked ammo can, he took out his reloading equipment. He selected heavy, deep-penetrating bullets from his stock, designed for the thick hide and bone of the largest game. He measured out precise charges of propellant on a balance scale, his movements patient and exact. Each grain mattered. Too little, and the shot would lack authority. Too much, and the pressure could destroy the rifle, and him with it. Each completed cartridge was a perfectly calibrated instrument of destruction, a sentence passed and sealed in brass and lead. He polished each finished round and seated it in the rifle's internal magazine, the metallic click of each one a final, satisfying note. His rucksack was packed with the same cold efficiency. There was no room for comfort, only for function. High-energy pemmican bars, rendered fat, dried meat, and berries, a brick of pure fuel, a bag of mixed nuts and dried fruit, strips of venison jerky, a stainless steel thermos filled with scalding hot tea brewed with rose hips for vitamin C, 2 extra pairs of thick wool socks, a luxury he afforded himself because frozen feet were a death sentence. His first aid kit was geared for catastrophic trauma, a combat application tourniquet, packets of hemostatic powder, and a syringe of morphine. A compact isobutane stove for melting snow. His snowshoes were lashed to the side. He carried only what was necessary to kill and to endure. Total pack weight, 35 pounds. Light enough to move fast, heavy enough to survive. He dressed not as a sportsman, but as a predator. His clothes were a motley of faded grays and whites, a winter camouflage that would break up his silhouette against the snow and rock. Layers of wool and down, silent and warm. Before pulling on his outer layer, he rubbed his clothes, his pack, and even the stock of his rifle with a handful of crushed spruce needles, an attempt to mask the sharp, telltale scent of man. He was becoming a ghost. He was unmaking himself, shedding the scent and shape of a human and taking on the camouflage of the wild. Before stepping out the door, he paused. His gaze swept across the cabin, the quiet order of his world. The neatly stacked firewood, the clean table, the silent radio. For a moment, it was no longer a fortress, but a home. He threw one last heavy log into the stove, knowing it would be a cold, dead husk long before he could return. The gesture was an act of irrational hope, a silent prayer that the fire would have a master to greet. He shouldered the rifle, settled the weight of the pack, and stepped out into the biting dawn. The cold was a physical blow, a clean shock to the system. He took a deep breath, the air searing his lungs, and began to walk, following the giant clawed tracks leading away from his violated cache. He did not look back. Ben Carter, the geologist, the grieving husband, the quiet hermit, had been left behind in the warmth of the cabin. The man walking into the frozen wilderness was someone else entirely. He was the hunter. The first 2 days of the pursuit were a masterclass in tracking, a silent dialogue between pursuer and pursued. The tracks told a story of more than just a creature's passage. They spoke of its nature. Ben read the narrative in the snow like an open book. Here the deep impressions showed where the creature had paused on a ridge, surveying the valley below. A place of observation. There it had leaped a 20-foot-wide creek, a feat of explosive power that left no marks of a running start, just 2 deep craters on either bank. Each piece of evidence confirmed he was trailing something of unbelievable physical prowess. The sheer mass of it was a constant presence in his mind. He found a place where it had pushed over a dead standing pine, 6 inches in diameter, simply to clear its path. Not with an axe or saw, but with a single brutal shove. More unnerving was the evidence of its intelligence. The trail did not follow the path of least resistance. It weaved through dense thickets of alder that would have torn at a man, followed wind-swept, rocky ground where prints were faint, and doubled back on itself in confusing loops. This was not the meandering of a simple beast. The creature knew it was being followed. It was actively employing counter-tracking techniques. Ben had to draw on every lesson his 30 years in the wild had taught him, his mind constantly projecting, guessing the creature's next move based on the lay of the land. It was a chess match played across miles of frozen terrain. On the second day, he found signs that began to unravel his core assumption. He discovered strange markings on a stand of aspens, 3 deep parallel gouges, repeated in a pattern. The cuts were clean, almost deliberate. Not the random scratching of a bear, but a deliberate symbolic mark. A signpost. A warning. Further on, he found a game trail blocked by a series of freshly felled saplings, arranged not by chance, but in a way that would funnel deer or moose into a narrow, inescapable corridor. It was the architecture of a coordinated ambush. It was a deadfall trap, but one constructed without rope or tools, using only brute force and a keen understanding of animal behavior. The chilling theory that he was hunting a solitary rogue began to crumble. One creature did not build a funnel trap. The theory shattered completely on the 3rd day. He crested a small hill and looked down upon a scene of utter carnage. A vast clearing was painted red against the white snow. The remains of a mature bull moose, an animal weighing well over 1,000 pounds, were strewn across an area the size of his cabin. It had not been killed. It had been dismantled. The ribcage was torn open, the massive skull crushed. And leading to and from the carcass were the tracks. Not one set, but at least 4 distinct sets. They varied in size, from the plate-sized prints he'd been following to smaller, though still enormous ones. One set, however, was truly gigantic, dwarfing all the others, its stride longer, its print sunk deeper into the frozen earth. The realization hit him like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. He had not been hunting a monster. He had been tracking it back to its pack. He was one man with one rifle, walking directly into the heart of a hunting party of intelligent, organized, impossibly strong predators. His situation had just shifted from dangerous to suicidal. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, walking willingly into the den. Instantly, his entire posture changed. The hunter's confident stride vanished. He became a whisper. He dropped to a crouch, sinking behind a snow-covered boulder. He moved from cover to cover, his eyes no longer on the tracks at his feet, but scanning the trees, the ridges, his six. He was no longer a hunter. He was a scout on hostile ground, a spy deep in enemy territory. He no longer risked making camp in the open. As dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, he found a shallow rock overhang and wedged himself into the freezing darkness, pulling his white poncho over him. He did not dare make a fire. He ate his pemmican cold, the fat stiff and waxy in his mouth. Sleep came in brief, feverish bursts, 20 minutes at a time, the cold stock of the peacemaker clutched to his chest. The oppressive solitude he had cultivated for decades was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty that he was being watched from all sides. Fatigue was a heavy cloak, but the adrenaline, cold and sharp, kept him from succumbing to it. As the fourth night of the hunt descended, Ben found a superior position. It was a narrow crevice in a granite cliff face, a vertical slash in the rock that offered a commanding view of the long, sloping valley below. The wind howled over the ridge, but in the crevice it was merely a low moan. He scraped away the snow, masked the entrance with a dead pine bough, and settled in for a long, cold vigil. From here, he could observe without being observed. He was a sniper in his hide, waiting. He pulled out his thermos. The tea was lukewarm now, but the small comfort was immense. He was hungry, bone-tired, and colder than he had been in years, but his mind was clear, honed to a razor's edge by the proximity of extreme danger. In the deepest hour of the night, under a sliver of moon that cast the world in ethereal silver, he heard them. The sound drifted up from the valley floor, carried on the frigid wind. It was not the howl of a wolf or the grunt of a bear. It was a language. The sounds were guttural, complex, and utterly alien. There were a series of low, resonant clicks, like stones being knocked together, a sound that came from the back of a massive throat. A deep, throaty rumble that vibrated in Ben's chest cavity even from this distance, a sound of both power and meaning. And then short, sharp barking phrases that followed a distinct rhythm and cadence. There were pauses, then responses. They were communicating. They were exchanging information. For Ben, a man who had lived in near total silence for half his life, the discovery of this alien syntax was a profound, bone-deep shock. It was the sound of a world he did not know existed, a sound that rewrote every rule. He raised his binoculars, the lenses cold against his face. On the crest of the opposite ridge, silhouetted against the star-dusted snow, he saw them. 5 of them. They stood tall and vaguely stooped, their long arms and powerful shoulders giving them a nightmarish, inhuman profile. But they did not move like beasts. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a terrifying purposefulness. 2 stood watch, their heads constantly scanning the valley, while the others gathered, their heads turning as they spoke. They were a patrol, a council, a tribe. They gestured with their massive hands, pointing down into the valley, then back the way they had come. They were planning. In that moment, everything shifted. The paradigm of his world cracked and reformed into something new and terrible. These were not animals. An animal pack is driven by instinct, by a simple hierarchy of dominance. This was more. This was a people. a species with a social structure, a language, a capacity for strategy. They were not merely living in this forest. They were its ancient, rightful masters. And he, Ben Carter, was the trespasser, the invader, the primitive. The cold rage that had fueled him for days guttered and died, starved at the oxygen of certainty. In its place grew a terrifying cocktail of primal fear and an overwhelming scholarly curiosity. Who were they? How long had they remained hidden in these remote mountains, a secret chapter in the book of life? The scientist he used to be, the man who once mapped the Earth's bones, awoke from a long slumber. He could not turn back now. He could not simply flee. The need to know was a gravitational pull stronger than fear. This was the greatest discovery in the history of the planet, and he was the only one here to witness it. His mission had changed. The objective was no longer to destroy. It was to understand. He had to find their lair. He had to see them up close. The risk was absolute, a fool's errand that would certainly cost him his life. But the pull of the unknown, of this impossible, magnificent discovery, was too strong to resist. He felt a strange sense of privilege, that he, of all people, was chosen for this. At first light, he shouldered his pack and resumed his journey. The tracks no longer felt like the trail of an enemy, but a thread leading to the heart of the greatest mystery on Earth. They led him steadily upward, away from the tree line and into the desolate, wind-scoured realm of ice and stone, where only the hardiest life could survive. The final ascent was a brutal test of endurance. Ben was now in the high alpine zone, a world of shattered rock and permanent snowfields. The air was thin, each breath a conscious effort that burned in his lungs. The sun was a white, merciless glare on the snow, and he had to squint against the brightness, his eyes watering. He was forced to use the skills of his youth as a geologist, traversing a small, crevasse-ridden glacier, probing the snow ahead with a ski pole. The tracks of the creatures continued, effortless and sure-footed, punched deep into the ice-crusted snow, leading him toward a sheer wall of black basalt that rose like a fortress into the sky. It was a place where no man had reason to go, a dead end against the roof of the world. He found the entrance not with his eyes but with his nose. A heavy, pungent odor drifted on the wind, the smell of wet fur, old blood, and a sour, sickly scent he could not place, like sickness and decay. The opening was perfectly concealed behind a curtain of ice, a frozen waterfall that hung like a row of prison bars. From a distance, it was just another feature of the cliff. Only up close could one see the dark void behind the shimmering ice. It was a natural, defensible masterpiece. He retreated 100 yards, catching his rucksack and snowshoes behind a jumble of boulders. He took only the peacemaker, his binoculars, and his knife. He was light, silent, and lethal. He checked the wind. It was blowing from the cliff face toward him, a stroke of incredible luck that would carry his scent away from the entrance. He began his approach, moving with the slow, fluid patience of a snake, using every rock and shadow for cover. He moved on his belly the last 50 yards, the rough ice crystals of the snow abrading his jacket, the cold a constant gnawing pressure. Above the main entrance, he found a small, precarious ledge. It was barely wide enough for his body. By lying flat on the frozen stone, belly down in the snow, he could peer over the edge and into the cavern's mouth, remaining hidden in the deep shadows of the overhang. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat he was sure they could hear below. He raised the binoculars. The scene inside the cavern, dimly lit by an eerie blue light filtering through the ice curtain, stole his breath. In the center of the large chamber, on a massive bed of moss and spruce boughs, lay a colossal creature. Its fur was grizzled and patchy, its great flanks were sunken, and its breathing was a ragged, whistling gasp. It was a female, and she was dying. Her eyes were closed, her massive head resting on the moss, a faint tremor running through her limbs. This was not a den of monsters. It was a vigil. Surrounding the dying matriarch were 4 other creatures. The largest, a massive male with scarred shoulders who was the alpha, gently nudged her face with his own, trying to get her to lick at a pile of snow he'd brought her. His movements were slow, careful, full of a desperate pleading. Another, slightly smaller, pushed a choice cut of moose meat toward her mouth, but she did not react. In a corner, 2 younger, lankier individuals sat huddled together, their shoulders slumped, emitting low, mournful, whimpering sounds that echoed softly in the vast chamber. And Ben understood. In a flash of absolute, devastating clarity, he saw the truth. The bent trap, the caribou in the tree, the desecrated cache. It had never been an act of aggression. It had been an act of desperation. They were not declaring war. They were trying to survive a crisis. Their clumsy, violent raids on his territory were the frantic efforts of a family trying to find easy food, any food, for their dying elder. They had lashed out in fear and frustration, like any intelligent creature watching a loved one fade. They had invaded his world not out of malice, but out of love and grief. The monsters of his imagination resolved into a family, united in a tragedy he knew all too well. He lay on the ledge, the cold of the rock seeping into his bones, a deep, numbing chill that reached his marrow. The peacemaker was already at his shoulder, an extension of his will, settled there by instinct before his mind had fully processed the scene. The powerful Zeiss scope brought the scene into sharp, intimate focus. Without conscious thought, the crosshairs settled on the broad, intelligent head of the alpha male. The leader, the biggest threat. The one who had destroyed his trap, his cache. The one who had brought him here. Ben's mind was a cold, efficient calculator. First shot, the alpha. A headshot would be instantaneous. Second, the one to his left, before the echo died. 5 rounds in the magazine, a 6th in the chamber. He could take down 3, 4 before they understood what was happening and swarmed the slope. They were large targets. The odds were not impossible. It would be a good death. A final, meaningful stand for the hunter of the taiga. Every instinct, every rule of survival he had ever lived by screamed a single deafening command. Eliminate the threat. End it now. They are not human. They are a danger. This is what the rifle is for. But his eyes betrayed his instincts. He saw the alpha male lower his great head again, nudging the matriarch's slack jaw. He saw the creature run one of its huge 5-fingered paws along her flank in a gesture of such profound and hopeless tenderness that it shattered something inside Ben. The gesture was a key, unlocking a door in his memory he had kept sealed for 30 years. It was a gesture he recognized. The ice-lit cavern dissolved. He was in a hospital room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic. The walls were a sterile white. His wife's hand was in his, thin and terrifyingly cold. Her breath was a shallow rasp, each one a struggle. He remembered the beeping of machines, a sterile, indifferent metronome counting down the final moments. He remembered the quiet sympathy in the doctor's eyes, a pity he had hated. And he remembered his own towering, helpless rage at a universe that would allow this. He saw his own grief, his own desperate powerlessness, mirrored in the eyes of the creature in his crosshairs. He was looking at a reflection. At that precise moment, one of the younger creatures, a female he realized, jerked its head up. Its large, dark eyes, full of a startling intelligence, locked directly onto his position. There was no mistaking it. He had been seen. A low growl rumbled through the cavern, not of aggression but of alarm. The creatures did not panic or charge. They moved with a sudden, coordinated grace. The alpha and the other two adults instantly rose and formed a living wall between Ben and the dying matriarch. They stood their ground, a line of silent, defiant protectors. They stared up at his hiding place, their expressions not of animalistic fury, but of wary, fearful intelligence. Their silent, collective gaze posed a question, not a threat. "Who are you? Why are you here?" Ben's finger on the trigger felt numb, a dead piece of flesh. The cold steel of the rifle was a foreign object in his hands. To pull the trigger now would not be an act of self-preservation. It would be an execution. It would be to murder a grieving family. It would be to become the monster he had imagined them to be. In that moment, he knew that to kill them would be to betray not some abstract code of the wilderness, but the last, flickering ember of his own humanity. Slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements, he lowered the barrel of the rifle. He did not scramble away. To flee would have been an admission of fear, an act of a lesser animal. It would have been a confirmation of his hostile intent. Instead, Ben began a slow, methodical retreat. He slid backward off the ledge, his movements measured and calm, keeping his body low. He did not break their gaze until the overhang concealed him. He did not turn his back until he was behind the solid cover of a rock outcropping. He was withdrawing, not running. It was the silent acknowledgement of a sovereign border, a concession from one predator to another, a recognition of their right to their grief, and to this harsh, sacred place. Behind him, the tense, watchful silence of the cavern returned. No sound of pursuit came. The message had been sent and received. When he reached the place where he'd cached his rucksack, he did something that defied 30 years of his own law. Survival in the wild was a ruthless arithmetic of calories. You never gave up food. You never wasted an ounce of energy or a pound of meat. But his internal calculus had been irrevocably altered. He had packed the entire hindquarter of a deer he'd shot 2 days ago. It was heavy, precious fuel, wrapped in cheesecloth, frozen solid. It was his insurance against the long walk home. He untied it from his pack, hoisted the bloody frozen weight onto his shoulder, and began to walk. He made a wide, circuitous trek around the base of the cliff, approaching the main trail that led toward the cavern from a different direction. He did not want to seem like he was challenging them again. He found a flat, open rock on the path, a place they could not miss, about 200 yards from their entrance. There, he laid down the deer haunch. It was not just meat. It was an offering, a tribute. It was his apology for the trespass, for his rifle, for his ignorance. It was a gesture of peace, a recognition that his world and theirs had collided, and that he was the one who had been in the wrong. He placed the offering and walked away without looking back. An act of faith. The long journey home was different. The forest no longer felt empty, a mere backdrop for his solitude. It felt occupied. The wind in the pines seemed to carry a new resonance, the silence between the trees, a different weight. He saw the land not just as his territory, but as a shared space. He was no longer the sole monarch of his domain. He was a neighbor. He felt the vastness of the wilderness not as a void, but as a container of secrets. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back with intelligent, grieving eyes. Days later, back in the familiar warmth of his cabin, he took out his journal. He turned past the sketches of the bent trap and the inhuman footprint. On a fresh page he wrote, his pencil scratching in the quiet room. He did not write about the creatures, their language, or their lair. That knowledge was too vast, too dangerous. It was a secret to be kept, not shared. To document them would be to betray them, to put a target on them for the world he had left behind. Instead, he wrote a single new article for his codex, placing it above all the others. A prime directive. Rule 0. You are not alone. The silence of the taiga remained, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a pact. A codex agreed upon without a single word, in the high, cold, and now shared territory of the wild.